Nice to see you all, especially on a wet day like today. So, we're going to make this a little bit, bright, this presentation, and looking forward to it. Somebody's just said, thank you, I can't turn camera on, but that's a relief for me. Alison, that's great.
The participants won't be able to turn cameras on, as this is a webinar format, so it's just us speakers with cameras. So if that is a relief for everybody, then that's all good.
So
your mics and your cameras will be off, but you will be able to enter things in the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. On the right hand side is sort of a blue rectangle with a triangle coming out the bottom of it. So do feel free to put things in the chat box, messages or questions that you have throughout the presentation. That'd be great.
So even if you want to say good morning and hello to us now, please do. And I'll start, as Dan says, the little talk box, chat box is in the bottom there, little bubble with a little arrow on the bottom of it. And we're going to also do some breakout into a question or a questionnaire, which we're going to make it interactive for you as well. So welcome to the webinar. Does your charity have an impact-led strategy, or are you focused too much on the money? And it's in partnership with Akivo. And so I'd like to also welcome, to the panel, Pete Johnson. It's nice to see you, Pete. Yeah. And thank you. I was going to say Akivo, I've worked with, I did my first work with Akivo 22 years ago. And Akivo is just an excellent organization working with chief executives to support them, especially at the moment with coronavirus. And you were talking about the community, the Akivo community being so powerful to allow people to talk with each other. And I think that's the great power of Akivo. So do you want to say a word about Akivo, or should we crack on from there?
Absolutely. I'll just say, obviously, we're a membership organisation with 1,500 members for charity leaders. And one of the main benefits of Akivo, as well as allowing you to connect with other leaders, is also connecting you to our trusted suppliers, more Kingston Smith being one of those. So we're particularly grateful to you, panelists, for putting on this session for our members, and look forward to it.
Thank you, Pete. And also I've got Jolanta. Good morning. I did enjoy your banter. Well, we're not going to give too much banter, but a little bit backwards and forwards. So join us in comments as we go through. I'm Mark Salway. I'm the Managing Director of Fundraising and Management within More Kingston Smith. And my two colleagues that join me today, Dan and Carl, would you like to just very quickly introduce yourself as well, guys?
Yep, I'm Carl Leatham. I head up our impact work within Mark's team, and it's good to be with you this morning.
I'm Dan Fletcher. I head up our fundraising strategy side of the consultancy. So it's great to be here too. So
without further ado, we're gonna take you through the presentation, and I want to we've got 30 minutes really of like sort of thought and taking you through this, and then we've got 30 minutes of conversation and chat amongst us to actually bring some conversation and some questions to this, and we'll have a good conversation. If it rolls on a little bit past 11 o'clock, yeah, we'll finish firmly at 11, but if people have still got questions at the end, we'll carry on from there.
The 11:30 mark, yeah.
11:30, sorry. And if people have got a couple more questions, I've missed half an hour. Let's start by framing the problem. When we were in 2008 and we had the financial crisis, organisations and charities, I was working across the charity sector. I saw all of those organisations going back and focusing on their strategy, and many of them went back to look at the reason why they existed. Well, actually, that should be quite clear to you. You exist for, the people that you serve, and be that, the older people, or be that health, or be that the environment or international development. You know who you exist for. But what you were really, as charities, worried about was the money. And then suddenly you started to think about the impact and the change that you bring about in the world, and it became quite a difficult thing to balance. So what we have done at More Kingston Smith is we've created a product that we work with different organisations, and so we're going to talk about Y Care International, we're going to talk about Age UK, we're going to talk about other smaller charities that we've worked with, and how do we get this balance right between impact and the money. That's what we're really going to talk about. And in there's all sorts of other things that we will touch on. For example, innovation. For example, how do you actually talk about business models? Trustees, how do you balance off, for example, governance and management? All of those good things. So that's really what the conversation we're going to have is this morning. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this impact versus money conundrum. And then we're going to take a step back and say, actually, with fundraising charities, we also have a distinct typology, or type of charity, where actually fundraising is getting the money to enable you to deliver. So how does fundraising fit into this mix as well? We're going to talk about the work that we've done and make it quite practical for you. So we're going to talk back to some of our case studies that we worked with. Time for questions. We've got half an hour, and we're just going to summarize and leave you to your days. So going back just quickly about Moore Kingston Smith, we regularly get voted as key in charity experience and expertise. I mean, all people like myself came to work for Moore Kingston Smith because we're very entrepreneurial. I've worked in the charity sector for 20 odd years, and as a consultant to the charity sector for 12 odd years. And I love the blend of being able to really be a practitioner, but also help organizations. We have 62 partners, 14 specialist charity partners. And the team that I run within Moore Kingston Smith has 3 different areas. So we're a powerful group of impact specialists. And you can see here Carl with Penny and Helen. And we do a lot of work focusing on impact and how do you tell the impact story. Then you've got Dan and you've got Emma there, strategic fundraising reviews, strategic support, case for support and reviewing fundraising. And then Marcus and myself, business model development, finance funding reviews, cost recovery, and especially myself and Marcus, we've done, 20 odd years of cost recovery. So this is the blend of different skills that we bring, and we all overlap, and we make sure that we actually overlap within that to create change for clients. So be that impact finance or fundraising change. So having introduced you to our team, having introduced you to people, I'm going to hand over to Dan for the first part, and we're going to cycle through the 3 of us. So Dan, it's over to you.
Great, thanks, Mark. So as Mark sort of introduced already, this session is really thinking about impact or money, and which is the most important, or not necessarily which is the most important, but which is driving your strategy. And we wanted to start off with a bit of a thought exercise about how do you manage to get the balance right between the impact that you make as an organization, how you bring about change for your beneficiaries, or how you manage your organization in terms of making sure that there's enough money to pay for the things that which you need to do as you run your organization. And this diagram here, think about the head versus the heart, is another way of thinking about that balance. On the left-hand side, we've got head type things, calculations, the money symbols. On the right-hand side, we've got thinking about the warm fuzzy things that your organization does, or the more tangible things that your organization does in order to help and improve lives for your beneficiaries. Which of those things leads your strategy, leads the thoughts, processes within your charity? And to some extent, this is something of an alchemy, and we're not alchemists, but it is something. It's very, very hard to get that balance right, to get the head and the heart working at the same time, or to get money driving your strategy and impact driving your strategy at the same time, and really one of those will always lead, and depending on which one leads will affect how you run and manage your charity. So in sort of that thought exercise, we wanted to try an experiment with Slido, which is we want to do a bit of a poll to see whether you are able to give us some answers as to where you think you're at in your organization in terms of thinking about your impact, thinking about your finances, and getting the balance between finance and impact right. So I don't know how many people have used Slido before, but if you're able to on your phone or on a browser, go to slido.com, and then you should be able to enter a code, and our code is MKSFM. And you can either do that, or you can, if you got a phone, you can go and scan that QR code, and that will also take you there as well. And you'll see in there that there's the first question. I estimate that we think about our social impact never minimally for a decent amount of time, for a substantial proportion of time, or for too much time. We've got a few people who've already joined the Slido, so I'm going to see if I can share that screen now. Which is nearly happening, but not quite. Okay, technology not helping.
That's looking good. I mean, you're seeing a number of people come through. Yeah, I can.
Okay, oh, great. I can't see it on my screen, so that's.
So I'll do the commentary then.
Yeah.
So
we've got 22 people. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got 22 people voted at the moment. You know, and Dan, the URL, if you've got that, you can click that into the chat box, and then people can click through as well.
Well, it's just slido.com. So
slido.com, that's fine. And then we've got 27 people or 26 people at the moment. For a decent amount of time is 56%. For a substantial portion of time is 26%. Minimally is 14%. Far too much time is 4%, and never is 0%. So most people are saying, for a decent amount of time, we think about social impact. Yeah. You know, but a good 15% are saying, actually, you know what, we're really not focused on this.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to the next question. So this is thinking about finances. Let's see what people think about that. For substantial proportion of time, yes, that's thought that might come up.
You see, I can't say anything because otherwise it will rig the vote. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 20 people are on there now. I can see that.
Yeah. I mean, I love the second one down here. Over a quarter are saying, well, 30% now are saying far too much time is being spent on the finances. You know, so for a substantial portion of time, 60%, far too much time, you're over 90%, just in like sort of really focused on the money. Well, 90%, yeah. So impact was probably, you know, 40-50%, but money is the if you like sort of the, you know.
So let's move on to the third question. I think we get the balance between finance and impact about right. Now, there may be a slightly leading question from the last two. Okay, some positivity there. We did say honest answers, but so I think we're getting some of that.
Can you see this, Dan, or do you want me to do it?
No, I can see it now. It's on my screen on my left. Okay. So some of the time is most people, and together we've got, yeah, again, about 80% of people either minimally or some of the time, maybe a little bit more percentage than that. So not so much of the time, or most of the time, and some people very honest, saying they never get it right. So that is interesting. Okay, we've got about 30 people who voted on that. I think we get a bit of an idea of the measure of where we are now. I'm hoping if I press stop sharing, and I'm now going to share the presentation again. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see the right thing now. And I moved on to the next slide, which says, what about fundraising charities? And this is just something we wanted to drop in here because partly because I'm come from a fundraising strategy perspective, but it think about the finance and thinking about impact, particularly is more critical in charities where perhaps you're driven by contracts and commissioned activity, and you don't necessarily do a lot of fundraising on top of that. At other times, the fundraising creates a challenge because fundraising often fills the gap between where you don't have quite enough finances to achieve the impact that you want to achieve, and then your fundraising income fills that gap and helps you manage to just about keep cash flow going and achieve some of the impact that you want to create. And obviously, in times of constraint like we have at the moment, fundraising can become squeezed, and then that makes that interface between impact and finance even more acutely obvious. So fundraising can sometimes be a thing which obscures the decision making that you have to do, but also fundraising can be part of the process which helps you to drive your work towards being impact led, and helping the finances to flow in at the back to fund that impact led activities. And I think I'm going to hand over to my colleague Carl, who's going to talk a bit more about being impact-led and understanding the impact that you make, and you'll see where the fundraising can fit into that. So over to you, Carl.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody, again from sunny Cheshire. I think we're all having rain today. But this is what you're seeing now is a kind of a process. We've been talking about a couple of pieces of work we've done recently where we've really amalgamated our different skills into a process, and this helps us think about how we approach a piece of work. Step one is the impact review. Now, to do an impact review, you really need to be reviewing either your historic outputs and outcomes information or gathering that anew. And so current data research based on your stakeholder engagement, that's a key area to get the information you need. And really, this is about building a framework over a longer period, or doing things that are immediately available to you. So according to the quality of data that you may have, will dictate just the nature of the impact review that you do. Now, we did an impact review for one of the organizations that Mark mentioned just earlier. And of course, this is a kind of a first step. It's a look at where do you think the impact lies in terms of what you're doing. And of course, that leads you to thinking about options for the future. Will you keep stuff that seems to be highly impactful? Are there areas that are less? So that leads you naturally into thinking about basing the future projections of your work through some kind of series of options. The third one here fits neatly with what Dan has been saying. There will need alongside that to be some kind of funding analysis about how you go about constructing that. And then of course the financial modeling. If you're thinking about options based on an impact-led strategy, then you need to know about costs. What's it going to cost? What will line A mean? What will option B mean? And what's the balance between things that maybe we no longer need to do and things that we must continue to do? And then the last step, I suppose, step 5 is a reporting process based on all of that. Now, we're going to step you through these. So I'm going to talk about impact, obviously, and then my colleagues will follow through on the other stuff. But in terms of core elements, there's probably a couple of ways to do this. If you take a pure approach, if you like, to reporting your impact, you're looking at something like this. You're looking about, at a very basic level, identifying your core outcomes and who you create those for. How much change are you creating? So, by virtue of that language, there's some measurement involved and the value of the change. Now, this approach is going to take some investment and time. And of course, during coronavirus, we didn't necessarily have a lot of time to invest in things. So there's other ways to think about impact that will actually lead you to a point where you can begin to think about building a framework to capture this. And I'm just going to take you very quickly through an indicative analysis approach. What's the difference? Well, one is much more robust in terms of the data you need and the data you have. And this approach, for example, is Still pretty robust if you have some information, but it actually works to help you think about the information that you will need to gather going forward. And you need some criteria to create this indicative analysis. You can see that you know, what we're looking at here is a very basic traffic light system. These traffic light systems, they seem to be popping up in various tools and methods quite a lot in recent years. But what we did with this particular piece of work for AIDS UK was to help them think about what criteria would work. Now, these criteria are consistent with impact methodology. The difference between this and a longer term framework is really the quality of the data you have or can have access to. So just to quickly go through the 6 criteria that we used. One was, do you have a clear view that what you actually do leads to the change that you're claiming? That's kind of about the efficacy of your outputs. We know that if we do A, it will lead to B. You'd be amazed at the impact reports that make huge assumptions about you know, that particular link. The second one was the work that we were proposing to go forward with creating change for more than one group of people? Again, you would give that a higher score, up towards 5 if that was the case, and a lower score if that wasn't the case. The third criterion was more about sources of evidence. Again, in our world, we see lots of impact reports that make claims and there's little evidence for it, and it's actually diluted the effectiveness of impact reporting. So it's quite good to be thinking about gathering evidence. Now, these first 3 clearly link to the claimed outcomes that you'll know well about. The second 3 are more about your ability to measure and manage impact. So do you have a way that you know you'll be able to value an outcome for your beneficiary groups? Counterfactual considerations, really important that you don't claim every bit of value that maybe others have contributed to. So what would happen without our intervention? And finally, do you have some kind of measure or indicator for the amount of change? This was kind of how we constructed this system. We looked at different elements of the service. Bear in mind that those 6 criteria, they mightn't be exactly the same for you, in the sense that there might be other criteria that, you know, are important. As long as those criteria fit with what we consider to be kind of the appropriate way to understand impact methodology, or, you know, it complies with the 7 principles of impact reporting. I'm sure that's a subject for another day, but as long as it fits with that, then, you know, to some extent you could create your own criteria. So you could see here that across those 6 criteria from the previous slide, we applied the scoring system. In this case, Help at Home was scoring highly. So what we're saying is that it's likely, in an indicative sense, it's likely that the outcomes from this work are going to produce strong social value, strong impact. And this can be really useful when my colleagues come to the kind of analysis of options going forward. Toenail cutting is, it's one of those areas that, you know, actually we can giggle a bit about this, but it's actually incredibly important to people who are older and less agile. And it's one of the services that the organization was strongly underpinning. So it was less here in this case about impact, much more about we still need to do this, or maybe the criteria for continuing with this element of the service was more about potential income or just the need. Now, I wanted just to give you a couple examples of, say, from the first 3 criteria before we move on. One was a piece of work I did, it's looking at this idea of the efficacy of outputs, a piece of work we did recently at MKS with the hospice. And it was really about people comparing their experience when they went to the hospice compared to what they experienced in hospital. we're talking here about patients who are facing, you know, the end of life management process. It's a huge area, very sort of the humility that we were able to experience talking to people like this, and also their loved ones. But it was obvious that they were reporting that the atmosphere in the hospice meant that they felt cared for. They felt that their concerns were important, and the loved ones of people who were very ill, they were much less stressed in this situation. They talked about in the hospital. You can imagine the NHS had a very difficult time. Doctors didn't have time to sit and meet with them and talk to them. You can understand that. So again, the actual link between what a hospice, this particular hospice, was doing and the outcomes that were being reported, that was a really strong link. It was a strong causal link, and you were able to say, you know, if we're able to create this atmosphere, then we would score highly here because of the nature of the outcomes that can be clearly linked to that. The second example here I have is about, you know, are you creating change for more than one stakeholder group? And you should score yourself, you know, higher on the scale if that's the case. I remember doing a piece of work in the Midlands with a substance abuse organization. You had it was to do with recovery. So people were supposed to have stopped using when they, you know, came into this scheme, and it was a service user-led scheme. So we found obviously that actually the change that they were creating was different for different subgroups. A young 17-year-old woman would have different outcomes to, say, a 50-year-old woman recovering from substance abuse. And not only that, but very often charities don't take into account other people who benefit from their service, like loved ones, for example. So again, if you could identify that that's the case, you would have a higher score on this. The final example here is just more than one source of evidence. And I did a piece of work some years ago. This was a work for Boris Johnson. This is my claim to fame. When Boris was Mayor of London, I never met the guy. I dealt with his senior civil servants. But Boris was worried about the development of the Olympic Stadium and young people growing up in the shadow of this Olympic Stadium, knowing they would never access it or never get inside it. And so there was a lot of youth work carried out in that context. And it was perceived that young people were on the streets very late at night. And so you may have heard the Midnight Football League was brought into existence for both young women and young men. And that created a great connection between getting young people into sport and having some interest in things like the Olympics. But it was important here that we spoke to young people, and we did that directly. Actually, we've got quite a good experienced team at Moore Kingston Smith on the whole stakeholder engagement area. So, you know, this is an important area. Talk to us if you're interested in that kind of thing, because there's nothing better than, being closely related to the people you're working with and doubly checking with them that what you're doing is effective. But the data that we had here for the impact came from talking to young people directly, talking to their parents, talking to the youth leaders who were able to observe the change that was being claimed. And also there was some additional research that actually reinforced that. Research independent of ourselves, but research that nevertheless reinforced the outcome. So again, if you can get more than one piece of evidence about the change you're making, that can be really important. So moving on, once you're mapping impact, you're able to report on it, then it opens you out to these other areas that we're going to talk about in terms of the options that you can look at. And I'm going to hand over to Mark now just to look at those a bit more closely.
I made the mistake of not unmuting myself, so I made the mistake, Carl. Thanks. So what Carl has just talked about is impact, but I'm going to take you back to the start of the conversation with Dan. Dan said that there's this thing about head and heart, and it showed from academic review and academic literature that you can't hold both of these things together at the same time. So this alchemy, this balance, is almost impossible. So you know, we're saying very clearly you have to choose one of those, and so we've chosen impact to start our review. Well, the next step on the chain then is you have to put the money against it. You've seen us talk about this in previous webinars from Moore Kingston Smith. I'm just going to whiz you through it very quickly. Through funding, the financial modeling, and then we'll open up for a conversation. So I've got probably about 8 minutes, and then we'll just have a conversation. So here is the next step. You know, Carl has shown the indicative impact. You've got a red, amber, green. You now need to work on the profitability of your services. And it's interesting for me because I'd say a third of all organizations we work with don't really know how to, for example, apportion overheads, don't really have a framework for talking about their costs and costing things, and so can't get to a profitability or a surplus generation for each area of their activity and work. And so they can't start to map off the impact that's achieved against the profitability. And so, you know, like any good management consultants, we've got a nice 2x2 grid where you've got low profitability and low impact, and you're agreed on that. Well, maybe that's a candidate for stopping, services, or maybe it's just an old service that needs to be innovated, and you need to think differently about it. In the top left-hand corner here, where you've got high impactful service and it's not profitable, it's about how can you create more money. So for example, cost recovery here is incredibly important to be able to understand how you can, you know, for example, cost and achieve getting proper money back for that. Or you ask yourself the question, you know, it's costing us, you know, we're subsidizing that service. Are we happy to pay for that from our unrestricted reserves? You know, is it a good use of money, and can we sign that off as such? Profitability when it's high and impact is low is interesting, because this is the bit where you get organizations feeling uncomfortable with culture. One is about making money, and yet you're a non-profit organization. That sometimes jars. And then when you actually bring that all together, you have impactful and profitable services. That's where you really want to be, which is the top right-hand corner. And so, you know, trying to move each of your different areas to that top right-hand corner is incredibly important. And once you've got your products in that top right-hand corner, you can't just leave them there, because you've got to you've got to innovate, you've got to invest in them to be able to grow for the future. And so I'm going to turn to the next page here, where you've got an example. It's a made-up example, but we just wanted to show you, for example, here, you've got you know, an older person's charity where some of the old day services and a non-purpose-built premises, low impact, low profitability. How are you going to either change those or stop them? You know, the top left-hand bubble here, high impact and low profitability, for example, help at home services, you know, really impactful, lots of reach, lots of work being done, but are they creating the money? And if so, how are you going to underpin that? How are you going to find the funds to be able to underpin that? And then where you've got down the bottom here, profitable services, you know, and impact fairly low, fundraising, for example, sometimes can be in that space. How do you ensure that all of your fundraising is done with the right impact message? And you're trying to move, you know, your products to the top right-hand corner here. By the way, please throw comments into the chat box. It makes it much more interesting for us to be able to read. So step number 2 is mapping out these options, looking at the profitability, looking at the impact. That's what we've just done. And then step 3 on this is saying, can we find the money then to pay for these? What about the funders out there? What about our fundraising? Can we get that, you know, money to be able to underpin it? And with YCare, and also with Age UK, and also with other organisations we've worked with like MEAP, we've talked a lot about funding and fundraising, and so talking through a funding cycle about the case for support, and does this stack up? Can you tell the impact story? Are you able to influence and inspire people, or help people to understand what life would be like without the services you provide? I mean, that's the why, and it's really important to get the why right first before you then go to the who, the how, and the how much. In other words, who are you going to go to and ask for the funds? Is it going to be government? Is it going to be fundraising? Is it going to be event driven? Is it going to be regular giving? The how can these audiences be approached? What's the ask? What's the words we're going to use? How do we tell our story? And then how much? How can we get on top of the numbers to see the return on investment that we're actually making? And of course, on the right hand side here, you've got the risks. The risks of taking certain options, maybe putting too much of your work in one basket, and the benefits. In other words, for the long term, are you able to see the money coming in year on year on year, so that you are able to see that money for the future? Yeah, and there's a longitudinal bit to working up your funding, not just looking at now. So, for example, if you do an event, it's great, you generate money now, but it won't repeat necessarily. Whereas if you get regular givers, they will give you money for the future. Yeah. So is profitability inhibited by funders having impact measures for Grant Usma? Absolutely correct. Yeah. And so back to the impact piece that Carl talked about, if you can't talk about your impact, this funding case for support becomes really quite difficult to define. So we've gone through step number 3, which also provides you the support for the rest of the organization. And I'd also say provides you for innovation money as well, so that you can innovate and support in a different way your organization. So into business model. And then you've got the hard end of things, which is your finances. And I'm just going to keep this really, really simple. I mean, we do a lot of work building financial models, looking at scenarios, and it starts with understanding the business model, how you make your money and how you spend your money. Yeah. And looking at the way that income and expenditure interact with the reserves, looking at financial health and the reserves policy, for example, the risk around that, looking at the funding mix. Do we have all of our eggs in one basket? And then looking at that in terms of fundraising. But as you can see at the bottom, it says it takes investment to be able to drive the business. And on the right-hand side here is a real example of an organization that we worked with. If you look at the red line, if nothing is changed, the organization will run out of reserves in 2 to 3 years. But if you go on a different tack and you change the way that you're doing things, then, for example, with technology, then maybe it will follow the blue line. But here's the thing, you've got to invest. And going back to that difference between, the trustees and management, and aligning the risk that you have, in other words, aligning your understanding of risk taking, it may be that together you feel very comfortable with your reserves dropping sharply and then coming out like this hockey stick, or you might say, actually, no, this is too much risk for the organization. We can't do this. So putting this into the workflow, understanding your finances and the financial model and getting the risk profile about right is an incredibly important part of your change. And then the final bit is implementation. So on the final of these steps is implementation. And coming up with the recommendations we take to trustees and the senior management team, placing impact at the heart of what we do, but ensuring that financial sustainability. And then the final thing is just saying, can we do it with the resource that we've got? Is this achievable? But because we've started with impact, we gained the buy-in of people around us, we gained the buy-in of board, we gave the buy-in of senior management team, and it feels really powerful as we move forward together. Yeah. So that's the methodology, we've used at More Kingston Smith, certainly with as I say, Y Care International and Age UK and others, focused on impact, mapping out the options, looking at how we're going to fund those, getting a financial model and getting our hands around that, including cost recovery, and then focusing on how we're going to implement and deliver that. So it's your turn now. It's you as a group out there, all of the Akivo members. It's lovely to have you online. We can't open up the chat so that people can speak, but what we'll do is we'll take the chat box questions or comments, please. And the three of us, Carl, Dan, myself, and also we're going to invite Peter back as well. So Pete, do you want to come and join us? Yeah, and
I'm back.
Great. We'll just really pick up a question. Ask Pete, do you want to comment on anything that you've heard so far?
No, it was well, one observation is the comment on innovation, and quite often people think innovation is this great brand new sort of flash idea, but quite often it's just looking at things that you're doing is making small incremental changes, and that can lead to sort of a greater piece of innovation. So that's one observation I had from your talk. But I guess right now, I suppose a lot of leaders, it's that they're on the hamster wheel, aren't they? They're sort of really sort of up against it, and it's sort of that balance of being on that hamster wheel, but also taking a pause and taking that longer term perspective and doing it, structuring it in the right way. So there's a lot of challenges for people right now, I guess, but this seems a fantastic approach.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to start asking the first question then. So, Alison Morey, you've asked a question, and I think it's probably going to go to Dan. Interesting challenge in the hospice sector as our funding model is usually a small percentage of statutory funding. For the first 3 months of 2021, this position has been reversed thanks to central government support, but with little or no certainty of what happens beyond that. I mean, how do you balance off fundraising, if you like, especially for a hospice that might come from the general public and now has moved back towards much more statutory? I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've worked in hospices before coming to work as a consultant, so I'm very familiar with the challenge of just having that small percentage, maybe 10%, maybe less than that, of statutory funding, and then having to position what the hospice does in relation to that, and the value in a message, a fundraising message, I suppose, which doesn't necessarily talk about the fact that you have a challenge of not getting much money from the government, but the fact that 90% of your funding comes from the community, from individuals, and therefore you encourage people to follow the crowd and be like that 90%, and to give in the same way. So your fundraising message is very much around encouraging people to get behind you in the same way that your current supporters have. And so what you do when they're very publicly the government seems to be supporting you, it does become a challenge. We've been working a bit with Age UK, as Mark has mentioned, and we're working on an emergency appeal, and that was another sort of challenge in some ways to the an emergency appeal that they were working on, that the public saw the government giving that 750 million to charities, and therefore that meant the case was very much weakened. I think it is about coming back to impact again and thinking about the long-term difference that you want to make in order to achieve change for your beneficiaries. And if you keep coming back and making sure your case of support focuses on that, but also that your planning focuses for that. The windfalls that you get along the way are useful, but it's that longer term trajectory that's more critical. And I guess understanding the finances, the way that Mark's talked about with the financial modelling, helps you to be able to factor in those sort of windfalls, but also recognise that your messaging shows that you're still going to need large chunks of money in the autumn, next year, the year after, and that's not always going to come from the government. So your case remains strong that you need support from all sorts of people to to be able to continue to meet your beneficiaries' needs. That's kind of how I'd approach that.
Cool. I mean, shall I just pass on the question? But I mean, we agreed that we'd just grab a question and ask each other. Yeah. So I mean, I'm gonna go back to Pete's comments. There's a comment from Anna here. She says it's really interesting to hear Pete's comments about innovation. We've recently taken one of our services online and had successful delivery through Virtual Rural Week. Several of our funders have got in touch to say how impressed they are with the flexibility and how we've demonstrated this. I hope that results in more donations when we go back to them for more funding. I mean, are you seeing that amongst your members, Pete, that where people have done things in an innovative way, it leads to, you know, one, funders being impressed that there's a flexibility, and two, more money off the back of that?
It's not consistent to all. It does vary, but I suppose initially there is an investment in a new approach, and if you're able to, I think sometimes people feel that they'll see an early return. If you do, that's fantastic, but that's not always the case. You've got to build in that time for that investment to show, and selling that message to the board, to the trustees, and to the staff can sometimes be difficult. I think it's about, obviously, when you're setting up a new initiative, being incredibly sort of realistic as to how long it's going to take for that to sort of bed in and for that income to show. It sounds here from the person that's asked this question that there's been an immediate impact, which is phenomenal, but that's not always the case.
So it's all about relationships then, and taking those forward then?
Absolutely.
I've got a technical question for Carl, yeah? And I'm sure this is one that others on the call will share as well. I mean, Simeon Perry is saying, look, the Moore model is actually very finance focused. There are other models that can be used instead of SROI, such as Social Value UK, Hack Data Bank model. What are your thoughts of these models as alternatives? Is that one that you can handle, Carl?
Yes, there's no problem with the work that has been done under the hacked modelling. It was, though, for creating a series of well-being metrics for use in a housing association situation. At Moore Kingston Smith, we use some of the well-being metrics that have been developed by the likes of Act Folk and Daniel Fujiwara, who has developed a whole area of work around well-being metrics. There's no marriage in my head between defining your impact, measuring and managing it, and the SROI methodology. One of the difficulties that arises is if you use one of the other systems, make sure that you're following the principles. And make sure, for example, when you see a well-being metric that you think you could use, make sure that your beneficiaries are experiencing that change before you use the metric. One of the criticisms of the well-being metrics use is that people don't go through the disciplines of asking their stakeholders what's changing for them. They take shortcuts and end up telling stakeholders or creating leading questions because they know they've got a metric that can measure that particular thing. So we're not stuck with a particular methodology, but a health warning around just using systems without actually applying them to the principles. Grant has asked a question, Mark, about have you worked with organizations to get stakeholder and recipients to define impact measures? Grant, it's the only sort of work I want to do is the bottom-up work that you refer to. And I touched on that in my last answer. If we're defining the impact or the social value of what our work is, leading to, and if we only use an organizational view of what we think should be changing without asking what actually is changing, then we're going, I agree with the implication of your question, where we're going down the wrong track. The whole point of effective impact work is to find out what your work is actually leading to. And then by all means, compare that to what your aims and objectives were in the first place.
We've also had a question from Kat Dixon, which I don't think we've covered yet, which is how does influence of market conditions and commissioner landscape play into this model?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take that. It's interesting, Kat, because what we're seeing in terms of commissioners is that some commissioners are saying, look, actually if you like, sort of the red tape that we had before has been removed, and we need to do everything to help people, and that's given a freedom for some commissioners to actually help in a different way. Other commissioners are like sort of hunkering down and being much more focused on the rules, if you like, and yet other commissioners are wanting innovation. So it's the first thing is it's not a level playing field. Where commissioners would feed into this model is step 3. It's the funding piece, and so you're talking about how do you pay for these things. It might come from commission services, it might come from your fundraising, but it's all about understanding how you're going to pay for the services that you have actually defined. So understanding your impact first of all, but then layering that with the money underneath. Has market conditions changed? This? Absolutely. And we're seeing, I think, a short-term, change also in terms of fundraising, where, as Dan said, it's moved towards COVID-19 and funding for COVID-19 and away from some of the other sectors. But I think that balance will come back to what we've seen in the past. How people give, though, will probably be quite different. I hope that explains, Kat, about commissioners and helps you.
I think that there are a couple of questions. Carl Richardson from Salter Jim and Andy Stevens have also asked sort of related questions about how you respond to rapid changes in circumstances, in falls of income, different ways of delivering services or not being able to deliver services, perhaps due to social distancing at the moment. So Carl sort of asks, do you agree that we should use the restart to establish a new baseline and beneficiary expectations? So moving into a new normal, just being able to respond to whatever that new normal might be. And Andy is sort of asking, do you apply the model that we've talked about over sort of in a one-off way and then review at regular intervals? So is it something that you just do once and then you, but how do you come back to it? So and right. I suppose there's something there about lots of stuff changing. How do you respond, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go first of all to Carl. I think it's a really interesting point that Carl's making. I used to see people or organizations come and wanting to talk about either surviving or changing their model in an incremental way, and I'm going to call that evolving. Now what we're hearing is also organizations saying, we're just not viable. We need a revolution. We need a rethink. So Carl, I would take the step back and say, first of all, are you still in a survival mode? Are you in, you got yourself stable, but we need to change for the future incrementally, an evolve mode, or are we in a revolution? Or do we need to change ourselves fundamentally? And I think until you understand that, you won't have a baseline that you can work from. I think, secondly, I think Andy's question is well framed and beautifully, put. We've got pressure to act quickly. I think you have to map I think you do a workshop very quickly where you look at the impact versus your profitability, stroke surplus that you generate for different services. If you can't get to that, which a lot of charities can't do, you need to go back to finance and work through quickly to get to that picture, that position. And a lot of organizations that I've worked with in the past, but specifically under coronavirus, are now saying to us, we need your help immediately and urgently to try and work out what our profitability per different service line is, so that we can map off then the impact against that. And I think you can do that if you've got the information fairly quickly, and then you're going to have to keep reviewing this. But don't forget fundraising, yeah, because typically how fundraising plays into the model is forgotten about. But it can take 2 to 3 weeks. it can take one session. It depends on the information you've got. But if your financial information isn't well aligned, you're not going to be able to do the analysis in the first place. I hope that helps, Andy.
But I think, would you say, Mark, it's also true that you're probably not going to have all of the financial information that you need to be able to make all of the best decisions all of the time? So you need to be able to work with, getting 80% of the way there is good enough in order to make the sorts of decisions that you need to make now, but be ready to, when you get other information, to change tack and to be agile in the process at the same time.
And I think you're raising a really good point. To what I found with finance function staff is that they are too transactionally focused. They're not strategic in their thinking quite often, and that strategic gene is missing. That doesn't enable organizations to then have a strategic look at whether services are making money or not. So, for example, you've got lots of information about how much salaries cost or how much travel cost, but you've not broken it down per service. How much does help at home cost? How much does, for example, shopping service cost? So I think there's that element of it, Dan. I think the second element of actually getting that information out is we're perfectionists as finance people often, and good enough information at the moment is good enough. We've got to take quick decisions. So I think there's two elements to that question: getting the right information quickly. Secondly, getting a strategic resource or help just to be able to get the finance team or function to think differently.
And Carl, something that we've talked about in previous webinars is around understanding the impact that you're making, particularly when you're changing services or responding to the new need. And some of that impact stuff you can do it in a long, detailed way, or you can have a few. You can be a bit more agile on that as well at times. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think I was trying to say that the indicative model is something you can do more quickly. One of the people who joined us was making the point of using different systems to measure your impact that are cheap enough for a small charity to use. But you can begin this stuff today by simply thinking about the difference between your outputs and outcomes and how you're going to start thinking about your outcomes. And it reflects back to what Mark has just said. If you're going to base public policy on your impact report, then it needs to be pretty robust. But if it's an internal decision that needs to be taken in a crisis, like we've just, like we're in right now, good enough is good enough, and it's about a balance of, making that decision on the basis of the risks that you take when you go forward with data that's maybe not as robust as you would normally have.
Okay.
Carl, I'm going to be very rude. I'm going to interrupt and say we've come to the end of time. People are busy.
Yep.
I've got two final slides that you just want to talk through. So I'll leave Carl to have the final word. And from me, just thank you.
Okay. Yeah. We're just going to finish up. Thanks for your questions. We're just finishing here. The impact-led strategy that we've talking about. When we run seminars at MK, in other words, in the olden days when we were able to talk to people face to face, lots of people have plenty of vision about what they do, but it's quite a different matter to be, transferring that vision into a set of structures that will achieve that going forward. And that's what we mean when we say it's more about thinking of the models you're going to use to achieve those things. So how do you balance impact and finance? It is about creating the balance. And I hope that what we've been talking about today will inform some of the other areas that you may need to visit in order to do that. And we've asked the question, is your strategy led by a measure of the impact? Notice the words here, they're very deliberately cited here. It's about measuring your impact and then using that knowledge to make gains in terms of the strategy to achieve that, but also improving your ask in terms of getting people to invest in what it is that you're achieving. So these last points about is your fundraising strategy aligned with this. I think someone said earlier, it's really important that you know your impact, be confident that you've measured that, be confident that, you know, your internal messaging in the organization shares that view of what your impact is, and then base both your future services strategy and your fundraising strategy on that. Last question, can we help you? Well, you know, if you need help with this stuff, please do talk to us. That can be a few minutes on a phone just to talk about a particular area. It can be a more formal relationship with you if you know, if that's appropriate. But you know, the point of us doing these webinars was to get us into a position where at least we were, you know, having a conversation with people and you know, getting some sort of message out around us being here to help. Talking about being here to help, just to wrap things up, do please stay with us in future webinars. Please come back. We're trying to think about how we can help best in terms of the place that charities find themselves in right now. So on the 25th of June, we'll be looking at financial sustainability, more in the coming environment. We've been through the initial sort of COVID-19 experience, and we now know that potentially it's going to be with us for a while. So there'll be, you know, a period of time when perhaps we need a different strategy to think about carrying on. The 2nd of July, impactful fundraising. That's two of our disciplines being put together in terms of thinking about what I was just saying a few minutes earlier. Know your impact, but make sure it's integrated into your fundraising ask. And Dan and I will be talking a bit about how to improve your fundraising ask based on your unique selling points, if you like. And then later on in July, we're going to be looking at fundraising and finance working together. Do please link to these articles on the right-hand side if you feel that there's something there that could be useful. There's an impact measurement toolkit there. Fundraising through a crisis is a short article. All these articles and tools have some tips for how you can take things forward. And finally, if you feel that we can help you, even in a you know, a 30-minute dedicated time together, then just please use the link here, and we'd be delighted to talk to you about that. I think it just remains to thank everybody for being with us, and please stay in touch. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Dan, Paul, Mark, thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete, for the opportunity.
Pete, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Take care. Bye-bye.